Okay, perfect. We can wait a couple more minutes in case anyone is showing up late, and then we can start and I'll let people in as they just come in.
Okay, great. Okay, should I start sharing the slides just so we can get started, and then if people join, will you let them in?
Yeah, that'll be good.
Okay. Let me just share my screen. Oh, can you accept the like request to share? I think it's not letting me.
Yep, I allowed you.
Great. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right. So I guess we'll get started. So first of all, I'm Penelope. I'm a senior at Marlborough in Los Angeles. I've been doing LD debate since eighth grade, and I just went to my first tournament on this topic at Apple Valley this weekend. So I'm excited to get started with November, December. So first, just going to briefly go over the resolution so that you all know what we're talking about. If you're not aware, the resolution for November, December is the United States ought to adopt a wealth tax. And today we're going to go over what a wealth tax even is, some of the core advantage ground that we've seen, and some things that we'll probably see soon, some disads and counterplans, and then a little bit of critiques. I'll mention some case stuff and Phil stuff as I go through this, but for the most part, I know the most about policy, so that's what I'll be focusing on, especially since that will be more, tied to this topic. And if you have any questions, I'll have some time for that at the end, but you can also Slack me at any point. So, we've had two tournaments on the wealth tax so far. There have been a bunch of AFs, and we'll go through their general ground and talk about like the core neg positions. But hopefully, this talk will give you sort of a sense of how to get started with research and what everyone's thinking about. So, first, what is a wealth tax? It's kind of easier to define it based on what it isn't. So, a wealth tax is distinct from an income tax, which taxes how much money someone makes per year. It's also distinct from taxes on transactions, so excise and sales tax. Although we've started to see, and I am assuming we'll see soon, some more AFs that try to sort of build in some taxes on transactions. The fact that it is distinct from an income tax is why a wealth tax is controversial and how we have these core debates on this topic, because it means that you're taxed on things like assets and money that you're not making over the year, but wealth that you're holding, which the United States does not have in the scope. So, since the resolution only has one modifier, that being wealth modifying tax, there are definitely going to be a lot of T debates. There already have been, and I think there will continue to be. And these will probably be different than living wage T debates because there will be less emphasis on precision and more about what models of wealth tax debates work best, since there are a ton of examples of what a wealth tax looks like in many different ways. So we have some empirics to sort of frame T debates. France and Norway and a couple other countries had wealth taxes. So there's definitely a sort of real world standard. And you can start by looking at France and Norway as good examples of what a wealth tax looked like. France actually repealed theirs because it didn't go so well. So that's a good example. So a couple things that are sort of questions on the tea debate. First is whether one-off taxes are topical. So there's a pretty big question about whether or not a wealth tax, especially in this resolution, and adopting a wealth tax would entail a one-time policy or a consistent yearly policy. All of the real-world empirics have usually been year to year. Another question is whether or not the United States adopting a wealth tax includes deciding where the money goes. So that's another T question. Can we fiat offense, or can we garner offense off of where the money goes? There's other questions like, is a capital gains tax topical? So is the stocks of a company, is the stock in a company increasing? Is taxing that increase topical? Are corporate taxes topical? Are subsets topical, which is always a question, things like that. So there's a lot of questions about what a topical AFF will look like on this topic, which is a big part of the debate. But the core of it is a wealth tax is a tax on money that is held, not money that is actively made. That's an income tax. So hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of where we're starting. So let's talk about the advantage ground. So far, there's been a huge variety of advantages. There will definitely continue to be more. There's only been a couple tournaments. But one thing to be careful of is watching out for cutting AFFs and debating AFFs where their offense is based on the tax itself and not where the money goes. So in general, we will probably not be able to garner offense off of fiating where the money goes because that's probably extra topical. Some AFFs that have tried that have been losing to extra T in the last couple weeks, but that could always change. The one exception to this is debt AFFs. So AFFs that garner offense off of not what the US is spending their money off of, but instead the US needs more money. We're in debt to other countries, and a wealth tax would be a great way for us to get enough funds to start paying that back. So, for example, only a really small portion of the US money supply and debt is being spent on things like Social Security. So there's a sort of normal means argument to be made that if we were able to enact a wealth tax, even only on a certain portion of billionaires, because remember, subsets are probably topical. So, there's always a subsets debate, but even a small number of people taxing their wealth would probably be able to contribute to more social spending and things like that. So there's a lot of normal means debate. So obviously the core of the topic is probably going to be inequality and econ advantages. So for the inequality advantage, a wealth tax is pretty inherently redistributive. Some people might also say pre-distributive. So taking money away from the richest people has a lot of effects, but first just has an implicit impact on inequality in the United States. The uniqueness debate is pretty easy here because there's massive inequality in the US right now. So one of the core arguments that's made on this topic is a wealth tax quite literally just takes money away from the richest people, gives it to the government. Super simple. The impacts debate is one that gets a little more complicated. There's different internal link chains. For the econ debate, a big part of the argument here is that rich companies and billionaires are usually most articles will use the term hoarding wealth. So they're not spending it. It's not turning into productive economic capacity or economic actions. Instead, it's just being held by the richest people, which can be really damaging because it means a bunch of money is just sitting in place instead of being used. So again, this is where the distinction between a wealth tax and an income tax is really important because we tax money that is, and we already have sales tax and things like that. So there are taxes on money moving around, but there are not taxes on money that's just sitting in the form of assets, or there are many fewer taxes, which is kind of the core of this debate, right? It seems a little backwards to not tax money that is just sitting in place. So that contributes to a lot of the richest people and rich companies sort of holding money and not contributing to the economy. Another big argument is climate. This usually comes from carbon tax AFFs. We've already seen many. My team is running one, and we'll probably see many more carbon AFFs showing up. The key distinction is people running climate wealth tax AFFs are distinct from a SQUO carbon tax. So it's not taxing carbon, it's taxing carbon intensive wealth. So companies that are producing emissions or things like that. This is when the subsets debate comes up again. but the thesis of it is climate debate is a good example of AFFs that we'll see where the tax is used to sort of punish one industry and get people to steer to another industry. So if you can tax companies that are emitting, you can incentivize companies to move to a different industry. And again, uniqueness debate is pretty simple for climate advantages. Climate change not going super well right now in the SQO, and obviously impact cards are quite easy to find. So thesis of that debate is tax carbon intensive industries, tax the rich people that are, contributing to a lot of climate change, and get people to shift to green energy. Don't put a wealth tax on companies that are staying pretty green. Another advantage area is global leadership, which I have not seen an AFF that makes a blatant hedge argument yet, but I think we could see it. The main argument so far is that we need the United States to make big swings in climate change to get other countries to follow on in climate change, so like a carbon wealth tax, or we need the United States to demonstrate that we're prioritizing solving inequality or solving poverty via the redistributive effects of the wealth tax. So that's the thesis of the global leadership arguments, is the United States needs to do this in order to influence other countries. Another argument to be aware of is people are reading a Brazil global leadership advantage. The thesis of this is that Brazil has pitched a wealth tax that only taxes about 3,000 people globally. It is only the richest of the rich. And they've pitched this to the G20, which is a group of governments. And the argument is that if we enact a wealth tax, or adopt a wealth tax rather, we'll give Brazil some global legitimacy. So be on the lookout for those advantages. And this could contribute to a hedge argument, i.e. the United States needs to, boost our economy or solve inequality in order to stabilize global hedge. But in general, the hedge proper debate is going to be a little messier, since it is implicitly like the government gets more money, but we're also taxing all the billionaires that are making money in the United States. But we'll get to that when we talk about some of the neg positions. The debt argument I already went over. I think it's the simplest advantage on this topic. Take money from the rich people, give it to the government. That helps with our debt problem. And another thing to be aware of is the scale of the wealth tax. So depending on how many people you tax, even if it's very few, maybe it's a larger percentage. There are plans like Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax that is only on people making over so I think it's like 500 million, who have over $500 million, face the sort of the biggest burden of the wealth tax. But again, you can get a lot of money out of the government can get a lot of money out of the wealth tax. Another argument that goes sort of hand in hand with the inequality scenario is sort of democracy advantages. So there's implicit problems with having a society where the majority of the wealth is held in the top 1%, which is very much the case in the United States. So it's a good way to garner offense that is specific to the US, because you don't really need spillover to win democracy advantages that are just like the United States needs to maintain an actual democracy. That's really hard to do when all of the power is in the hands of the rich. If you haven't heard the term elite capture before, excuse me, it refers to the idea that when a small group of rich people have most of the funds in the United States, the government's policies will be very favorable towards them and not to the entirety of society. So if you have, 20 billionaires with a ton of money, you can already see this in examples like Trump, appointing Elon Musk. It leads to what we call elite capture, which is when the government is enacting policies only favorable towards them and not spending on things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and things like that. You can see that the terminals to that leads to, mass amounts of poverty, a lot of risk of corruption in the government, authoritarianism. The uniqueness debate is going to be probably pretty good here because we've seen the effects of sort of the rich people's influence on the government right now. So big thing will be to keep reading the news as these advantages continue. And then the last one, and again, I'm going through these pretty quickly because we have a lot to get through and not infinite time, but if you have any questions about any of this after, you can Slack me or ask on this Zoom. Another core part of advantage ground on this topic is probably, or so far that we've seen, is the monopolies debate. So there are a lot of big companies that have sort of hedge over their industry. And one way to break that up would be to enact or adopt a wealth tax. It could be specific to those companies, a corporate wealth tax, or it could just be something where it's whole res, but it does affect those companies the most because they hold a lot of the wealth. And the benefit of this is that if you make it so that a company needs to make profit and not just like holds their assets, because remember, they're already being taxed on like income tax is already a thing. So this is just about taxing the wealth. So being able to force companies to be productive by um, taxing whatever is just sitting there could be a way to break up monopolies. And again, there's also the sort of government punishing through taxes side of this, which is just if rich companies are holding a lot of money, we might want to foster competition by breaking that up, giving some money back to the government, and letting small companies have a chance to thrive. There's a lot of really good cards on why small companies innovate more. They take bigger risks. They have more to gain and less to lose. Arguments like that, and some great terminals about why innovation is key to countering a ton of existential threats that are coming now, etc. I think from what we've seen so far, many of the AFs have innovation scenarios. You'll see that this is pretty responsive to the core negative ground on this topic, but it means that sort of having growth and inequality and econ and innovation, all of those are good. Like the good thing about this topic is it is expansive enough that you can have a pretty true structural claims with a bunch in there. So actually, if anyone has any initial questions on just AF advantage ground, I know that's a lot to go through, so feel free to ask now. Anyone have anything? Okay.
Could you re-explain the climate wealth tax part?
Yeah, of course. So the main thing we've seen for climate is a carbon wealth tax. So the idea of this is you're taxing what a lot of the articles call brown industries. So for example, you're only enacting a wealth tax on, you're only sort of enforcing a wealth tax on companies that emit a certain amount per year, or maybe a wealth tax on brown assets. So if you own stock, let's say you're just a billionaire, not like a company, and you own stock in an oil company, maybe you're getting taxed on only that subset of your wealth, which incentivizes people to invest in the renewables industry instead of brown industries. So the argument is that that will create a sort of shift from investment in brown industries to investment in renewable industries, and that will be enough to overcome like SQUO investment problems. Okay, I see does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's a subset, right?
Yeah,
And
it would usually be a subset.
so like it's different from like a carbon tax app because that's like a different mechanism, right?
Yeah, so a carbon tax in the SQUO is usually a tax on carbon consumption. So like if you go to a gas station and you buy gas, you're getting taxed an extra amount for buying that gas. There's a lot of arguments against a carbon tax, but it's distinct from a wealth tax. A carbon wealth tax is taxing the brown assets themselves. So it's not taxing people for buying gas, it's taxing the oil companies or the gas companies or the billionaires investing in those companies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great. Okay. I see there's a couple questions in the chat. Give me one moment. Okay, so a wealth tax, that's a good question, Mira. A wealth tax is primarily, the distinction is just that it has to apply to wealth. So that could probably be people or companies. There is a T question. I think most of it would revolve around one, the precision debate. So who has better definitions of what a wealth tax is, but probably more realistically, the sort of real world predictability debate. So a lot of the T debates will look like the NEG saying real world wealth taxes have been on people, not companies, and the AF saying, well, if we have good enough definitions, you could have predicted it. I think there will definitely be some debate over whether or not you can tax companies, but a good workaround for things like the carbon wealth tax is tax people for their investment in those companies. So like you want to get rid of brown industries, tax people's investment in those brown industries. or you want to get rid of monopolies, enact a wealth tax on like the owners of those companies, things like that. So that's one good workaround. But I also do think it's definitely not impossible to win a tea debate on we're allowed to adopt a wealth tax on, I think Peninsula is running an AF that's like adopt a wealth tax on anti-competitive companies that engage in anti-competitive behavior, things like that. Does that make a little more sense? Okay, great. I know this is a lot to get through, so again, feel free to ask any questions at any point. But yes, if you're noticing that the big question with this has a lot to do with tea debates, I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger thing as the topic progresses. So there's questions about, can you adopt a wealth tax on just 4 billionaires? Could it be on the top 300 richest people? Could it be a one-off wealth tax? A lot of those affect what advantage area is sort of fair game. But when you're thinking of this from the NEG perspective, what you want to prep for, having a good set of T definitions handy that exclude companies and exclude fiating where the money goes, things like that, is a good toolkit to have. Okay, let's talk about the negative. So first of all, there's a couple questions that I'm going to go over these as disads, but a lot of these you'll probably see as case answers as well. Sorry, I'm not the best with slides, so it's a little chaotic, but I'll go over everything. The first is the question of constitutionality. So because of a couple complicated constitutional or sort of aspects of the Constitution, including what's called the apportionment clause, the government has a restricted ability rather, to unequally tax different groups. And this is to sort of prevent punitive like tax as a punishment. And so this is definitely a debate to be had. There are certainly cards that say that a wealth tax is unconstitutional because it's like unfairly puts a burden on only the richest people or only the richest companies. And that's a big question. People are reading Constitutional Convention counterplans that sort of get out of court's disadvantages by like having different actors do the plan. But a big question for the constitutionality debate is, what can fiat get us out of? This will come up a lot on this topic, is like, can we fiat that the courts say yes as well? I think probably yes, but people have different views on fiat. The other thing is, I want to make it very clear that the only way constitutionality would be a problem is if the AF gets put into place because of fiat, then someone challenges the constitutionality of the AF, and then in the courts it gets overturned. I think fiat probably means that it won't actually be overturned, but people have a lot of arguments about whether or not that first case would cause court clog or trigger like a second look at other cases, whether it could lead to follow-on, lack of faith in the Constitution, other constitutional challenges, things like that. You can sort of see how that goes. And while I'm not going to talk about Phil a ton in this lecture, there's certainly a contracts argument here to be made, / I've seen this be made in debates, including against me, that say that the AF is not constitutional or is constitutional, and therefore we're obligated to do it under contracts with the government, or rather are not obligated. I've seen both sides. Okay, the econ disad. This is probably going to be the core of this topic. We've seen it a lot. We'll continue to see a lot. Many of the disads will be quite similar. You'll notice that a lot of people are reading disads that always have the same uniqueness and impact, but several different link stories. I think a good strategy on this topic is to combine many link stories in one so that you can sort of get at all aspects of the bigger picture of a wealth tax's impact on the economy. So I'm going to go over a couple links. Each of them could be a whole lecture on their own, so let me know if you have questions. But you can also look at many teams' wikis who competed at Apple Valley for a lot of different ways this plays out. The first is the stocks link. So the idea that people would like pull out investments if they knew that their investments were going to get taxed. The idea that people would stop investing in large companies if they knew that their investment was going to be taxed, or sorry, would stop like building large companies, things like that. And then the idea, the like sort of perception-based idea that the minute we say we're going to tax rich people, there's sort of instant panic in the stock market. And it does not really matter whether the stock market is stable long term, because that instant sort of moderately irrational collapse leads to a crash that kills the economy. So that's one linked story. If it sounds confusing, it's because it is. There's a lot of different arguments. Some are perception based, some are not, that can be made for that. I'd recommend reading through some of that evidence. It's pretty interesting. And there's one of the good things about this topic is there really are a lot of people writing super explicitly pro and anti wealth tax, whole res, like explicit, just outright arguments. Another argument is capital flight. I grouped this under econ because most of the impacts are econ based, but people will also read this probably on the case page as solvency arguments. So capital flight is the idea that if we say every rich person or every rich company in the United States is gonna have to pay the wealth tax, companies will just leave. They'll go to another country. We have pretty good empirics for this. France adopted a wealth tax and all the rich people left, and then they panicked and undid the wealth tax and everybody came back. So it's definitely not a made-up argument, definitely very real. There's some fiat questions about whether an AFF can fiat enforcement mechanisms. For example, some proposals like Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax argue that one way we could stop capital flight is by making it so that if you leave once the tax has been announced, you kind of pay the wealth tax on your way out. So you pay an even bigger portion if you try to leave. But the main argument is not that people would leave right now. It's that new innovators will innovate somewhere else. And you might say, wait a minute, doesn't matter if they're innovating somewhere else, it's still innovation. But the argument there is it's bad for the US economy, which is independently bad, and that the US needs innovation, right? We have like an innovation-based economy and an innovation-based mechanisms for fighting problems. So we need innovators to deal with pandemics and terrorism and arms racing. So lots of reasons we need innovation here. Another argument is investment. Kind of went over that in the stocks the stocks scenario, but people won't put their money in companies or in assets if they know that it's going to be highly taxed. They'll put their money either overseas or they'll just start spending it. There's definitely some link turn debates about like, wait a minute, if they realize that sitting money is going to be taxed now, they'll start spending it, and that's actually good for the economy. But that link story sort of goes both ways. And then another argument, which I think is pretty straightforward, is the unemployment link story, which is basically the idea that if rich companies, so keep in mind, the wealth tax taxes the value of could tax the value of your assets, which means some people might not have that cash on hand. So if I own a business and I technically have $5 million or something, actually more realistically for the plan, let's say like you had $500 million, but all of that is in your business. You don't actually have that cash on hand. And now you're paying a 10% wealth tax and you got to find a way to get $50 million. One way you could afford that is like by firing people, so you get to keep more of your profit. That's a core debate on this topic, is like what happens when you're taxing people on their assets, but that doesn't match the like cash that they own. So we'll talk about this on the counterplan debate as well, but that can lead to some problems. What if you're taxing a farm? You know, their assets are all in the land itself. If you're making them pay 10% of their $50 million farm, what are they going to do? They can't like give you half the land, so they're going to have to sell some of the land. So you can see how that has some runoff effects. Okay. The IRS disad, I'm blanking on what the acronym stands for. I think it's the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS is the part of the government that manages taxes and is responsible for overseeing, you know, who gets taxed when and making sure they're getting taxed the right amount. The main argument that we've seen, this also came up on the living wage topic and will probably come up frequently, especially because it was read on the college topic that related to taxes a couple years ago, is can the IRS handle a wealth tax? It's a new burden. It might mean that they're too busy to handle other things like implementing the Inflation Reduction Act or dealing with cybersecurity or modernizing their technology. The idea is basically the plan bogs down the IRS and prevents them from doing other things. There are sort of two reasons for this. One is that people will evade taxes. So that's when people are literally like refusing to pay taxes. Evasion is illegal. There's also tax avoidance, which is different. It's when people are finding legal loopholes to avoid paying the wealth tax. That's a pretty good case answer, is that people will engage in tax avoidance or tax evasion. And the answer to that defense is probably, well, the IRS will enforce it, which then gets you the link to the IRS dissent. So you can see how that story sort of fits together. Personally, I think fiat should get anyone out of the link to the IRS dissent. Fiat obviously means like any plan that goes into place would probably get new funding. But regardless of what I believe, I think that's going to be a core debate on this topic, is like, does fiat mean the IRS will get more money in order to deal with this? I think a pretty logical answer is, of course they will, because the government will have more money now that they're making people pay a wealth tax. But again, big debate to be had. Okay, politics. Since the election was a couple weeks ago, I know, or was that last week? Wow. I know people were used to reading politics all the time before that. And I'm sure if you've read the state's counterplan before, you've noticed that this topic is pretty friendly for the states to the state's counterplan. The problem is there's kind of no politics decide right now. So really, really hard to make any argument. I mean, obviously no elections decide. You could try to run a 4 years in the future elections decide, but it's going to be pretty difficult right now. Probably difficult to get any agenda politics in right now, especially as we're sort of on the brink of transfer of power. Some people are trying to run Ukraine aid. I would not recommend politics right now, but I do think that dip cap is an argument. You can think of it like international politics. So that's the idea that the United States as a government has a set amount of diplomatic capital. And by enacting this wealth tax, we'd be spending our diplomatic capital. There's definitely a possibility of a link turn here. We might build dip cap by doing this good policy that's like, regardless of its effects on our economy, pretty obviously like positive for solving some inequality and poverty issues. So there's some dip cap arguments, but the issue with the state's counterplan is no matter how good it is, you need a net benefit. Maybe some courts arguments, I don't know. But I would say keep reading the news. The core thing with politics always is just to always keep reading. People's thoughts on a wealth tax change very frequently, especially based on who is pitching it. So when Elizabeth Warren was pitching a wealth tax, it got a lot of hate. But there have actually been some people on kind of both sides of the political spectrum advocating for a wealth tax, because very frequently a wealth tax would only target the richest of the rich or the richest companies of the rich. So it actually is like quite popular. That is those are the core dissad debates. Before we move on, any questions? I know this is a lot.
On the IRS dissad,
Yeah.
we were talking about like tax avoidance or like legal loopholes. What are some examples of these?
Yeah, so for example, and these, so for avoidance, a lot of it will overlap with other disads. So one might be moving your assets offshore. So like capital flight is kind of an example of tax avoidance. Another would be undervaluing your assets. So the way the government knows how much taxes or how much tax they need to get from you is based on the value of your assets, which is, easier to figure out if we're taxing a company, because especially if it's publicly held, we know how much it's worth. But harder if we're taxing rich people who are holding their money in houses that maybe gained value over time. So rich people can do things like pay the government person who comes to their house to see how much it's worth to undervalue it, which leads to them having to pay fewer taxes. Another example is just not paying the tax. Like the IRS has so many people to go after that sometimes, like, especially if the tax applied to a larger sector of rich people, there's a pretty good chance some would just not pay it. Especially if they have ins in the government or have enough money that they have an incentive. However, I do think that a wealth tax would help cut down on tax avoidance because to a certain extent, because for example, one of the ways people get out of paying taxes right now, I'll use Donald Trump as an example, is that if you hold all your money in assets and you don't have any income, you never have to pay income tax. And you might say, well, then how do they afford things if they have no cash? But what they do is they hold their money in like assets. So own $100 million house, and then you get loans from the bank to pay for things. So you say to the bank, hey, I have $100 million. It's just in my house. And I borrow some money from you to spend on a car or, a school, whatever. That's a way that people end up not paying any tax, even though they're holding hundreds of millions of dollars. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. It's a little complicated, but that's why the distinction between income tax and wealth tax is so important, because in order to make sure rich people are actually paying taxes, you have to tax the assets that they're holding, not just the money that they're spending. So if you have one takeaway from what is a wealth tax, that's the main thing. Tax what they're holding, not just what they're spending. It's the main reason why a lot of people don't pay taxes in this quo. And then another thing to keep in mind, there's an argument that the AFF will make, is that wealth compiles faster than the economy grows. This is like, if you want to write down like a key term for this, if you're interested in researching it, it's like usually written down as R over G. The argument is that the rate of return on wealth is faster than the rate of return on growth. So if you don't tax wealth, then the wealth will grow empirically faster than the economy grows, which means that people can be starving because the economy is flailing and rich people are still making more money. So again, arguments that should frame the disad debates, which is why I think the strongest econ disads will be the ones that have fast, short-term perception-based impacts, because they don't have to deal with the long-term, like maybe a wealth tax is good, but if it freaks everyone out and kills the economy and we all go to war, not too good. Okay. Any other questions? Oops. Feel free to put them in the chat if you don't want to say them out loud. Okay, we'll move on to counterplans for now. So first, picks, couple things. One is farms. As I mentioned earlier, big thing on this topic is that there's a couple industries, like the farming industry, where most people's wealth, like the wealth of a farm owner, is not held in cash. It's in the assets that they own. So if you start taxing it, they actually can't afford to pay the tax. They might only have thousands of dollars, not millions, but their assets are worth millions, which means they'll have to sell their farm, which could, kill the farming industry. Or they might have to charge higher prices for foods, which is probably a more realistic version of the farms disad, which is like, okay, now the government's saying I have to pay them a bunch of money that I don't have, so I'm going to start charging you $15 for a carton of eggs. Things like that. Another thing is picks out of individual corporations. So if people get away with company or with corporate wealth taxes on the AFF, you can pick out of certain companies that are doing good things, like green energy companies. Another argument is individual people. I've seen people read Elon Musk picks. I'm sure we'll continue to see more. My guess is that many of the picks will be semi-ridiculous, but some of them will be pretty good. It's kind of early on in the topic to predict all of these, but I think there's a lot of individual industries, people, and companies who probably shouldn't have all their money taken by the government. Okay, the main thing for counterplans on this topic that we've seen so far and that we'll probably continue to see is advantage counterplans. So since the AFFs are pretty reliant on solving things like inequality and econ, that's like kind of generic. There's a lot of things that could solve that. Since people like reusing stuff, we'll probably see jobs guarantee counterplans, universal basic income counterplans that help people in the United States make money and helps redistribute money. Again, perm debate is questionable because how do we pay for a universal basic income, which is where the government gives everyone money? Well, we probably pay for it with taxes. So who are we going to tax? Probably the rich people through a wealth tax. But perm probably links to the net benefit. So a couple questions there. There's a lot of advantage counterplans for econ. So I would say core for inequality is UBI and jobs guarantee. For climate, we've seen things like renewable investment counterplans, space bubble counterplans, which are like, certain technologies that could help solve climate change, things like that. And then for econ, there's a lot of things. So to boost the economy, we could do things like enact a living wage, since again, people like recycling. Or we could, enact some random policy that allow, I don't know, deficit spend to give people more money. I think a lot of these, it's just gonna be random ones that crop up. So more important, if you're prepping an AF right now, more important than having an answer to every position is having a good reverse causal reason why a wealth tax is key to solve. And I think a good warrant for that is the R over G argument, that since wealth grows faster than the economy, we need something that targets wealth specifically. So boosting the economy is not enough. Wealth will always grow faster. Okay, process counter plans. Everything's kind of the same as usual. People will keep reading the Sunsets counterplan, which means check back in 25 years and see if we should still do the plan. People will keep reading consult counterplans, especially consult the G20, since the thing I mentioned in the beginning, which is that Brazil is pitching a wealth tax, probably consulting other countries, maybe consulting the rich people, to get out of some politics arguments if those come up. Another thing that kind of changes is the courts argument. So like, if people can get away with saying that the AF happens through Congress, maybe there's a counterplan that we should, I don't know, do it through the courts so that we get rid of constitutionality disads. People read this at Apple Valley, so you can look on their wikis for some courts counterplans. I think Strake was reading some, and yeah, a lot of people will be reading those, but again, process will mostly be generic. Although I do think the international relations, especially like IR consult counterplans, are probably pretty good on this topic, considering that since global follow-on will be a big thing, it's probably a good idea to consult other countries. But if I don't know everyone's level of experience here, but the main arguments will be pretty standard: competition, etc. Can't solve business certainty, can't solve investment scares and stuff like that. The reason this slide is kind of light on counterplans is because we haven't really seen yet any like the sort of the counterplans that will be core to the topic depend on what ground ends up being like decided upon as topical. So if people start losing a lot of debates when they're reading corporate AFs, then corporate taxes might end up being counterplan ground. Capital gains could be counterplan ground, as in taxing like increases in the value of companies instead of taxing, sorry, there's water running. But then there's, I don't know if you guys can hear in the background. So there's things like that. So again, the T debate sort of controls how the counterplan debate will look. I would honestly recommend looking at AFs as like also possible counterplans if you can win a T debate. And then again, yeah, picks are huge. Farms, certain corporations, stuff like that. Any questions on counterplans? Oops. Okay. Critiques. So first, quick disclaimer, I am very much not a K debater. I don't run Ks very frequently, and I don't know a ton about them. And because I'm usually debating against them, I don't see them as intrinsically tied to the topic as much, given that K-links are usually not, like, especially since the last two topics have been pretty similar, might not always be, like, germane to the plan. But I'm occasionally flex, and I've already had a few K debates on this topic, so there will definitely be some. So the first is, first of all, just to set up the K debate here, similar to a living wage, it's another, the like big question in K debates is like, this AF is probably pretty, like AFs will probably pretty clearly be against large businesses and against rich people having power over the government, but they will give more power to the state. So if you have any familiarity with Ks, that'll sort of set up the K debate. And I know we're running short on time, but first, the capitalism critique. There are link cards that say that a wealth tax boosts capitalism by tricking people into thinking, by basically placating people. So, see, we did a good thing. We redistributed a little bit. So think of capitalism as better without actually solving the root cause. There are arguments that taxes themselves are a tool of capitalism, and the AF is endorsing that. I think those are probably the best cap K-links, but I'm sure we'll continue seeing more. Settler colonialism. One is that taxes are definitely rooted in a history of settler colonialism. So there's a lot of cards I've already seen that make pretty descriptive claims about how taxes are like fundamentally used as government tools of oppression. But again, link versus link churn, there will also be set call affirmatives that say we need to force the government to pay taxes, either as reparations or as a form of giving taking money from the rich and giving it to people who deserve more. But also actors of the AFF will usually be the state, so you always have a state link. Wealth tax gives money to the state. So there you go. There will always also be generics. I've already seen a lot of people reading pessimism critiques, especially against inequality advantages that claim to solve for inequality, since anytime someone reads an AFF that says, my one policy can solve inequality or poverty, there will probably be a critique that says that's backwards thinking. You can't do that through use of the problematic state. But those are the main arguments. I think cap and set call have the most out of all the critiques, cap and set call probably have the most cards that say the word wealth tax in them. But there will definitely be more. And if you have questions about K-debate, you should totally reach out to other people on the Women in Debate Slack and reach out to each other and ask your mentors, and check the wiki, because especially K-Team's wiki, because I'm sure people will find more cards, but obviously taxes are a big part of settler colonialism and capitalism. So there will be a lot of questions there, a lot of questions about the jurisdiction of the government, things like that. And to briefly mention the Phil debate, that'll probably be the big thing, is like, is Kant in favor of taxes? He's probably not. Is there a contractual obligation to tax people or the opposite? Things like that. I know we are sort of running out of time, so I'll wrap up. That's the sort of core, those are the quick basics. But if you have any questions, you can ask me now or always email or Slack me. Happy to talk about anything, and I'm sure we'll keep learning more as the topic goes along. So you're welcome to ask me or your mentor or mentee any questions as we continue. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, wait, I think there's something in the chat. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Can you re-explain really quickly what the R over G stuff was again?
Yeah, sure. So it's a little confusing, but basically the argument is that when you have, so money can be held in the form of wealth, or I'll simplify it. Okay. R over G explicitly just means that wealth grows faster than the economy grows. Another way of putting that is that the growth of the economy is disconnected from the growth of wealth, which can lead to a lot of problems because it means that corporations can get richer and it can artificially look like the US's GDP is going up or that companies are thriving. While the economy goes down, while the economy goes downhill. So the problem there is you can get situations where it looks like everything's going fine because the rich people are getting richer and because companies are growing and again, GDP, but individual, even as individuals are getting richer, like the overall economy is tanking. So the argument there is if you do things like boost the economy via more government spending, all you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So like you're helping the economy get boosted a little, but all the wealth is still filtering to the richest people. So solutions aren't really working. So it's an argument for why no matter what you do, all the money is going to go to the rich unless you tax wealth. And the reason for that is because since wealth can be stored and only have positive gains. So if you're storing wealth in the form of like a house or in the form of stock in companies, like there's ways to do that without really losing any money. You're not doing risky investments. You're just holding wealth. You can do things like put it in the bank and just get money from like loans, basically. So just interest and stuff like that, accruing over time. And that wealth will grow faster than the economy will. So there's sort of that disconnect. So like we need to address the growth of wealth in order to actually make the economy more like non-artificially stable. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense.
It's okay if it doesn't. Is there a piece of that that makes less sense that you want me to go over? Because it's a sort of, I don't know. It's a weird argument.
No, I think it makes sense.
Okay. A thing to look up if you're interested in learning more about that is one, just R over G. And then another thing is I think his name's Piketty. So let me make sure I'm spelling this correctly. It is Pickety. And I think if you look up Piketty R over G, okay, I'm spelling Piketty wrong. It is Piketty. And the argument is just like net rate of return exceeds growth, so we can't ever help redistribute wealth unless we tax the wealth itself. So the rich accumulate profits faster than the rest of the economy does. And it is an argument, like the way Piketty explains it, is this is the root cause of wealth inequality. When we help when we help everyone, we actually end up helping the richest people the most. So there will be infinite inequality unless we start targeting wealth instead of income, or just targeting the overall economy. That will never work. We need to focus on wealth. So Thomas Piketty, Wealth in the 21st Century, I think is the name of his book. Capital in the 21st Century. But you can look up things like that, if that makes sense. Are there any other questions? You can ask about literally anything in this slideshow. There's a ton to go over, so happy to talk more.
For lay debates, what are some strategic positions do you think I should put?
For lay debates, okay. I would say on the affirmative, the inequality, econ, and debt arguments are the clearest. They're easier than climate and stuff like that. Debt is super easy. I would say debt is a great lay argument. You can say the wealth tax is just helping the government pay off its debt, which frees it up to spend on other things like Social Security and other government programs. Debt, totally good. That's great. I think inequality is also very clear because it's literally just let's take money away from the richest people and make society more equal. Simple, straightforward. And then, yeah, I would actually say inequality and debt are probably cleaner than any other econ scenarios. On the negative, I would say capital flight is good. You don't need to call it capital flight if it's a little confusing, but the argument is just rich people will leave, which will strand the US economy. That's one good negative position. I would say another one is probably trying to think if IRS is, if you feel like you can explain IRS in a simple way, which might take a little bit of practice just because sometimes the IRS DISAD can get a little muddled in the details, but the core of it is just a wealth tax is just really complicated for the government and it will make it harder for the government to administer other functions. So I think that's a core piece of it. So capital flight and IRS, I would say those are the simplest, most core to the topic arguments. I'm not super familiar with lay debates, so I don't know how much you can put in a 1NC / how many cards are expected for each thing. But if you have other room, I would say constitutionality is probably going to get messy in a lay debate because a lot of it depends on evidence comparison and fiat questions. But IRS, capital flight, and then you could probably cut some basic econ scenarios about I think stocks is probably the cleanest. So you announce a wealth tax and the stock market freaks out because they think everyone's going to leave and stop innovating. So the stock market tanks overnight. And then you can, use empirics from 2008 to show what happens when the stock market crashes, which is basically global instability because of how much of the world relies on the US economy. Does that sound
Okay.
good for play debate?
Yeah, can you explain the debt app a little bit deeper, please?
The debt scenario?
Yeah, the debt app.
Yeah. So the idea behind that is that the government right now spends way more money than it has. So we're like trillions of dollars in debt. And it means that when we collect taxes right now, so when we're taxing people on their income and stuff like that, it's not actually getting used on government function. So when we take money, we're not using it to pave new roads and pay new government employees. We're using it to pay back China and Europe and countries that we owe debt to or that we are in debt to. So the argument is that a wealth tax would give us an insane amount of new funds. So if we could tax all these companies and all these people, we could make billions of dollars and spend that on like either we could make progress on like we could make more progress paying back our debt, or we could use that money to spend on social programs. So I would say the argument you want to make at its core is the US is in debt now. Money is not being spent on social programs. You can find some basic statistical evidence for this. It's just a fact that not as much money as we should be spending on social programs is actually being spent on social programs, and it's leading to, mass poverty and suffering because people can't afford food. So money that we could be spending on like food stamps and stuff is being spent on paying back our debt. So a wealth tax would provide the government with new funds to afford those programs, and that would help solve problems like poverty and starvation and health risks in the status quo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, wait, so what was the impact?
Oh, the impact would be solves poverty. And I would say that you could probably also do a pandemic scenario because there are some pretty good cards that spending on Medicare and Medicaid prevents/solves future pandemics by creating a more stable healthcare and vaccination system. So if I were cutting this, I would probably have a poverty scenario that talks about why poverty is bad independently, and then a disease/pandemic scenario about why we need government capacity to solve that. And then I would probably also do some research on just other things that the government could benefit by being able to spend on. So if only we could spend on advancing AI or advancing quantum sensing technology so that we are able to, keep our weapons up to date, or which is slightly impact turnable, so be careful. Or things like boosting our capacity to so for example, one of the things the government spent money on was the CHIPS Act, which helped us stock up on superconductors, which are a form of technology that is particularly important because many superconductors are in Taiwan. And if we want to not be as freaked out about China's advances on Taiwan, one thing we can do is be more independent about producing our own superconductors. And we need superconductors for things like phones and computers. So one argument is if the US government gets more money to spend on superconductors, there's a much lighter risk of war with China over Taiwan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is it possible for you to explain normal means, like what the concept of that is?
What the what is of that?
The normal means, like the concept?
Oh, the concept. Oh, yes. What is normal means?
Yeah,
Okay, so normal means is basically, so there's two sections of arguments, I guess, in terms of the plan in the AF. One is what do we fiat? So what do we say? What do we get to say? We're imagining a world in which this gets put into place. So fiat is like we're imagining a world where we adopt a wealth tax and the US government says if you have more than $500 million, you're going to start paying 10% of that to us every year. That's fiat. Normal means is, okay, because of the resolution, I can't fiat that we spend that money on Social Security, but I can make an argument that the government would always spend that extra money on Social Security. So that's a logical consequence of the affirmative. So a good term to use is a logical consequence of the plan. So when you're talking about what the AF does, you can say we fiat that we adopt a wealth tax. Normal means is that we use that money to spend on Social Security. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So normal means arguments require you to find a card that says the US government would use the funds from a wealth tax to spend on this. And you need to find a card that says it would, not that it should. Because fiat is a question of should we do the plan? Normal means is a question of would the plan lead to us doing this? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free to put any in the chat if there's anything else. Okay. If anything comes up or you have questions about things that start showing up later, things you find in the wiki, or if you're thinking through this lecture that I know has a lot of stuff sort of jammed into it and you realize there's something to ask about, you can Slack me or email me or DM me or whatever you want so that I can help. And if you have mentors or mentees, you can also ask them about this. That's what everyone's here for, and the Slack is always open. Thank you
Oh,
all for
I'm bad. I'm bad. I'm sorry, but I just remembered. We're talking about the Cap K, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And there was this thing about how like wealth tax does not solve for like the root cause.
Yeah.
So like I know like the root cause is capitalism, right? But like what about capitalism actually is the root cause?
Right. So some people would say that the profit motive is the root cause of inequality, and that's a fundamental tenet of capitalism. So the fact that we live in a society where when you do good things, you get paid money for it instead of like, so you can imagine in a communist society, maybe everyone's just helping each other, not because they're going to make money or get anything out of it, but because we all have a shared agreement to help each other. In a capitalist society, if we're doing everything for money, it leads to an incentive to not help other people and to just do things that will make you money, which leads to a lot of accumulation in the hands of the rich who just keep acquiring wealth. So maybe the reason why there's mass inequality is not actually because we just haven't taxed people enough. It's because we've created an incentive structure where rich people are hoarding wealth just for the sake of hoarding wealth and creating innovations just for the sake of making money off of them and not for the sake of shared means of production and helping other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Of course. I would say if you want to if you're interested in running the CapK, a good place to start is to look at cards by people like Haglund, and I mean you can go all the way back and read some Marx. And he makes a lot of arguments about what we're referring to when we say root causes. So Marx separates the base from the superstructure and talks about how most social phenomenons, which are phenomena, which he refers to as the social or as the superstructure, are actually just a byproduct of economic structures. So he says, profit-based societies lead to social phenomenons like exclusion and inequality and poverty, instead of the belief that those are just like things that cropped up on their own. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Chuping, what is the video that you sent?
Oh, it's the Win Debate CapK lecture.
Oh, great. Okay, yes. Olivia Orr is excellent and on my team and gave a CapK lecture and knows the capitalism critique quite well. If you're interested in learning more and running it, you should totally watch that video. Thank you for sending that. She knows a lot about it, and I think it will definitely be relevant on this topic because taxation is obviously a fundamental tenet of taxation is the idea that wealth is an intrinsic good, right? Like we should take money away so that we can do good things with it. And money is something that is, a positive feature of the economy. So, we should give it to people so they can do more. Communism or a socialist alternative would definitely look like eliminating wealth as a resource that's only available to some and using things like democratically shared means of production, stuff like that. But if you're interested in running Ks on this topic, yeah, I think CAP is great on this topic. Set call is, I mean, an AF that gives more money to the government is probably a stronger set call link than many other topics have. So it's definitely good to try. I'm sure there's also Baudrillard critiques that will pop up, pessimism critiques, futurity critiques, lots of stuff, anti-blackness. Yeah, things like that. So if you want to run some Ks on this topic, definitely a lot of places to start. And if anyone wants to hear about Phil, I can like point you to some other people, but I'm just personally
Yeah.
not super experienced. You do want to hear about Phil?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say look on from Apple Valley, you can look at some of the Strake Kids wikis, and then also Carey Academy RR, I think, ran a Phil AF. You can look at Strake MM read contracts against me in round 4, although to be honest,
Michael.
yes, Michael. Although I would not necessarily recommend running contracts on the AF because it relies on winning that the wealth tax is constitutional, and I think it's pretty easy to find cards that it's not constitutional, but you can do either. In general, looking through American Heritage and Strikes wiki will probably find you some Phil stuff and just any East Coast schools. But core debates on this topic, I would say like Kant is not a fan of taxes, so you can find some stuff about that. Rawls has some thoughts on inequality, so he's definitely written about it. John Locke has some thoughts on the role of the government, so that's another place to start. And yeah, I think that's the core of it. Lots of philosophers have thoughts on taxes. I don't know how many philosophers have thoughts on wealth taxes. But that's where I'd start if I were a Phil debater. Although, please read Util because it's the best. But you do you.
Details, true till for real, for real.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
All right, thanks.
All right, I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Penelope, for doing this. Do you mind putting the link to the presentation in the chat so I can like put it in our like YouTube description when we post the video?
Yes, of course. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna make sure it's like shared with everyone. It's not the most neat slideshow, but I think everything's there. Okay, let me just change the access thing. Okay, it's in the Slack. Or sorry, in the chat.
Okay, awesome. I will be posting this on YouTube sometime tonight. And again, thank you for doing this topic lecture.
Of course. Thanks for setting everything up. See you later.
See ya.